when I started writing science fiction, as opposed to reading it, and I started going to conventions and meeting authors that I'd read, I was startled to discover that most of them never went anywhere. They did all of their research out of Scientific American and National Geographic. And I was just stunned. I thought these people would be traveling all over the place. Nowadays, a few people do go, but most of them either don't have the time or the inclination. And I can understand that, but I couldn't do it unless I traveled.
Yeah, a lot of writers takes the page from the Jules Verne's thoughts, staying at home and writing and figuring out how to wing it, so to speak, with their stories. And some writers are very good at being able to convince the reader that they know what they're talking about, and some writers, just fell flat about it. So that's really good. And it's interesting that you said that you write outlines. Is that still something that you do? Is that something that was taught to you, or you self-taught that?
Did I still write what? I'm sorry.
The outlines that,
No. I can usually I'll get an idea in my head, or a character or something, and I'll generally try to get about 2 pages of notes, and I'll go back and scribble over them and make changes and rewrites. And when I think I've got the basis for a story, for a novel anyway, I'll go ahead and start writing it. And it'll change as I go along. When I was first starting out, I did do 10, 20-page outlines. But now I don't have to do that anymore because I know how to get from point A to point B. And so no more outlines.
No.
If I'm doing short fiction, I just sit down and write the story.
Okay. Well, because I know that, I guess that's like a learning process with all new writers, is they start with something basic like the outlines, but I guess once you get to your level of writing, and you've been writing for over 50 years, it's something that you no longer need then. You can just...
I think it's true of any artistic or creative enterprise. If you've been painting for 20 or 30 years, you don't need to worry about what color goes where so much, or how you're going to mix paints, or where you start sketching, or how to sketch for that matter. And same thing if you're composing music. You know what you have your tool chest is already full, and you know how to use all the tools. I think that's the same thing whether you play piano or do sculpture.
And I guess a common theme with that, talking about the art, is dedication and patience, and really patient with yourself. Would you agree with that? When you're right?
Dedication's one way of saying it. Persistence, I think, is the term I would use. People say, well, how do I write? I mean, how do you write a novel? And I'd say, well, you sit down in front of your chosen instrument, whether it's a computer or a dictation device or a quill pen and a blotter, and you stare at a blank screen or blank piece of paper until you put words down on it. And you keep doing that every day until you've got something. It's just, it's an old cliche, but the way you get something done is to do it.
Right. That's basically true for all things, is that you won't get something done without first starting it.
Yeah, it's sweat more than anything else.
Right.
You simply have to keep at it, even if you're not in the mood, especially if you're not in the mood. I mean, when you're feeling like, say, writing, and everything's good, and you don't have to go to the market, and the bank account is positive, and the weather is nice, it's easy to sit down and write something. It's when all those things are bad that you have to sit down and write something. People come up to me, with ideas. They say, I've got this great idea for a book. And I'll listen, and sometimes I'll say, that's a really good idea. Go write it. And the difference between writers and non-writers is the non-writers have good ideas, and the writers actually make them into a story.
I see. Yeah. I think another writer, Neil Gaiman, said the same thing when he was doing his road trip, is that the greatest challenge isn't writing when you are struck in the mood is when you're not in the mood to write. That's the hardest. You have to keep writing
Absolutely.
each day. And
like when I used to teach writing, it's page 1 is easy, and page 400 is easy. It's the 398 pages in between that's hard.
basically the journey from page 1 to page 400.
Yeah. I mean, you've got your idea, you've got your conclusion. Now go make a story out of it.
Absolutely. Which is interesting. And the other question that comes to mind is that a lot of writers struggle with which is the first page and the last page. How do you make a satisfying opening, and how do you make a satisfying ending? Because I see a lot of writers these days that are able to do a really fantastic opening, but when it gets to the ending, it kind of feels like they were rushing to the end, and it doesn't really feel that well thought out. The creation, they just forced it, kind of deal.
Well, for openings, I always tell people to look at television.
Mm-hmm.
Because with television, it's one of the first things you learn in writing for television is that you have to open a show with a hook. Particularly especially if it's a dramatic show. Because if you don't hook the viewer within the first couple of minutes, they're going to go watch something else. And that applies to books as well. That's why you have competitions where people enter things like best opening line. As far as the conclusion, that's actually much harder, because you basically have to sum up or bring to a resolution everything that's happened before. And that means you can't forget your story. And writers do that all the time, and readers call them out on it. It's like, well, this character here at the end of the book is completely different from the character in the middle of the book, and you don't do anything to justify the change. Or this conclusion feels tacked on. How many times have you heard that?
Right, and that's the same.
And so on.
Yeah, and that's the same feeling that not so much from the 70s and earlier works that been published. They feel, they remember the story, but it's afterwards more so in this decade, these last 2 decades, that really a lot of writing is like everything is good, but when you get to the ending, it feels tacked on. It feels like, they stopped it there because they didn't know where else to go, and they decided to end it. And it always feels like it brings a great book down to a good book.